So I'm going to introduce Barb Martinez. She has come a long ways, although this is home for her. Her family does reside in Saskatchewan. She's the National Practice Leader, Drug Benefits Solution in Great West Life. That's a long title, but she has got a very important role. She is the gal that really hankers down, and she works with Great West Life with respect to their drug solution opportunities. And what I really like about Barb is I had a chance to see her speak, and she's quite feisty. She's maybe a little bit more feisty than I am. And I love her. She's got a different perspective because her past career was as a pharmaceutical rep. So she's the gal we want on our team because she's the one that's fighting for the ability to better manage our drug benefit programs because it's a growing concern. It's escalating. Barb will talk a little bit about some of the stats that we're seeing and some of the movement that we see going forward. So with that, welcome, Barb.
Thank you so very much for that great introduction. Just got to make sure I'm positioned okay. So yes, I'm from Saskatoon. I love any opportunity I can to come and work here. So my dad thanks you. I spent a few days with him, my sisters and nieces and nephews. How's that? Perfect. So yes, very thrilled to be here. Now, I just want to lighten things up, tell you a little joke. Guy goes into a doctor's office. He has 2 fried eggs on top of his head and a piece of bacon hanging off of each ear. The doctor says, "You're not eating right." Is the food supposed to go in his mouth? Okay. All right.
We're not awake yet.
Okay. Maybe it was the lame joke. So I'm going to talk to you today about, we're going to start just looking at some drug trends from the Great West Life block of business, talk about new drugs and their impact on drug plan spending, and then we'll discuss how do we keep drug plans affordable and sustainable. I'm happy to have an open discussion. We don't have to wait till the end for questions. If you did want to make a comment or ask a question, please feel free to do so. So first of all, looking at Canadian drug spending, and this is all prescriptions that are filled in Canada that are dispensed through a pharmacy, a retail pharmacy. $25.8 billion was spent on prescription drugs in Canada last year. We filled as Canadians 651 million prescriptions. 70% of those were filled with a generic drug. So that's hundreds of millions of prescriptions filled with generic drugs in Canada every year. If that doesn't say they're safe and effective, I don't know what could. And certainly they are incredibly important at keeping your drug plan affordable and sustainable. Because while they may represent 70% of the number of claims, those 70% of claims are only 22% of the money spent on drugs in Canada. So they are very cost effective, they are very safe, they work well, and they're important to keeping your drug plan affordable into the future. What does it cost to provide a drug plan to employees? This is data from the Great West Life block of business. We have a roughly 9 million Canadians covered under our group benefit plans in Canada, so this would be very representative of the marketplace. So on average, it costs $1,499 to provide a drug benefit plan, and that is the covered amount. So that is the total cost of the claims. But when we look at the paid amount, how much did the plan actually pay? It's $1,055 on average, and so that difference is co-insurance and the plan members contributing to the cost of those claims. And that's another really important part of your benefit plan, is your employees need to have a stake in the game in order to help manage cost. If everything is free to them, they have no stake to help to control and manage costs. So I really believe in having at least some form of a deductible or co-insurance or cost sharing with employees so that they do care about how much the plan is costing. And you can see we really increase the amount that we spend on drugs as we age, and we'll talk more about that. The cost of providing a drug plan across Canada does vary. So when we look at Saskatchewan, $1,139 is the average amount that's paid per plan member. And what drives that often is the number of prescriptions that are filled. So in Saskatchewan, the average employee is filling 21 prescriptions. In other provinces, like the territories, the average person is filling 7 prescriptions in a year. That could have something to do with travel and distance. They're always going to get a 90-day supply because they have a long way to go, that sort of thing. And in fact, anything you can do to encourage your employees to fill 90-day supplies is always a good thing. So this just gives you a little bit of a picture of what it costs by province. And drugs are a really high touch point. 82% of members on average are going to fill a drug claim every year. It's not like that for other benefits typically. Not everybody's going to need a hospital room coverage or a physiotherapist coverage, not that kind of numbers. But so drugs are typically the highest touch point of any benefit. There are more people claiming drugs really than most other things in the plan. So it's important to your members. They care about their drug plan. They use it. And so cutting benefits and taking drugs away from people that need them can be counterproductive. What are the conditions that we're dealing with in a typical employee population? So this is, again, Great West Life block of business. So we're looking at what are the actual medical conditions that we're dealing with. So 17.6% of people have high blood pressure, pain, stomach hyperacid, I'm not even going to try and say that. But I'm one of those people. I take a prescription drug for stomach acid. A lot of people do. I just to be honest with you, the reason I take it is so that I can drink wine. Because without it, I can't drink wine. I get a really bad stomach ache. But speaking about benefits, is that a good spend of our money? So that I can drink wine? Sometimes I think we have to rethink things. We have clients that say, oh, the drug plan's costing too much. We're going to put in a cap and we're not going to cover those really expensive drugs. But you're still going to pay for all the drugs so people can drink wine? We maybe have to think differently about what we're covering. But this gives you a sense of the percentage of employees in a population that have different conditions. Now let's take a look at the same thing, but look at the drugs that we're paying for. So the number one category of drug spending are drugs that are biologic, and they're called biologic disease modifiers. And they treat conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, psoriasis. They cost on average $25,000 to $50,000 to $75,000 a year for each person. And so overall, they represent over 9% of total drug spending. And that would be typical of every one of your plans. Probably biologic disease modifiers are number one in terms of a category. And then diabetes, very commonly number two. So it's 8% of drug spending. Whoops, I'm going to try and go back. So you can see that 6.7% of people have diabetes. And that translates into 8.8% of the money that is spent on the drug plan. So it gives you a little bit of a sense. There's those darn heartburn pills again at 4% of total drug spending. 14% of people have it, but 4% of total drug spending. And that's what we're spending our money on. But what are we going to be spending our money on in the future? These are just some examples of the kinds of new drugs that are entering the market. So we have, for example, in the middle, a drug called Icrisa. And it's used for eczema and psoriasis, and it costs $580 for a tube. The previous drug that's already on the market to treat eczema is $150 a tube. So what happens when a new drug comes out, it has a patent, and typically a monopoly then, and so it comes at a much, much, much higher price than the previous treatments that the doctors could prescribe. We've got even a biologic, a very severe cost biologic drug for eczema at $34,000 a year. So we go from a few $100s a year to $34,000 a year for one person, and that's recurring every year, year after year after year. So, $250,000 a year for a rare disease drug, but again, it's a long-term liability or long-term cost to that plan. So this slide comes from the Canadian government, an organization called the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. And they look at drug trends and spending in Canada, and they try and help us understand what's driving the trends. And there are things that drive our trends up. Those are called push factors. And there are things that pull our trend down. Those are called pull factors. And so they measure push and pull and the impact between the two. So the pull effects, the pull factors are really around generic drugs. How many patents are expiring and what is the price of those generics? So we can see, if we go back to 2012-13, a very big pull effect, minus 9%, that with only a push effect of 8.5. So we actually had a negative trend 3 years ago. That was because of what was called the patent cliff. You might have heard speakers like me talking about this patent cliff. And so that's demonstrating the patent cliff. We were able to offset the increases by a lot of generic drugs coming out. But that's not really what's happening now in today and into the future. We're being driven by push effects. And the push effects are three things. An aging population. As we age, we have more health needs. Volume effect, so when we used to take 1 pill a day, now we take 2 pills a day. And the biggest impact is the drug mix effect. That is that replacement of the new drug over the old drug. Doctor forgets about the drug they used to prescribe because the sales reps, like I used to be, are there promoting their new drugs, and that tends to replace the older drugs that are being covered. So the government is telling us we don't have a big patent cliff anymore. We're not going to see a lot of offset of generics to combat the increasing cost of new drugs. And, and more importantly, there's a lot of new drugs coming, very high cost new drugs. If you're a pharmaceutical company, that's where the money is in these biologic specialty drugs that, cost $20,000 a year. Who wants to invent a drug that costs $800 a year, like cholesterol drugs anymore? Nobody. There's not a lot of profit in that. A lot of profit in this stuff. Now, this is the net change in Canada, so it was a 12% net change, but I thought you might be interested in what is Saskatchewan doing. So this is the same thing that breaks it down by province. So Saskatchewan had a net increase of 11%. Of 5.3%, pardon me. So this province actually does a really good job of balancing the push and the pull. They've got formularies. They encourage doctors to prescribe to generics to take advantage of those pull effects. And so I love this slide. It really demonstrates that Saskatchewan's doing a great job at managing costs under the provincial plan. And that helps employers in this province who are wrapping around those provincial plans. Oh, I thought I had a different slide that was coming about the number of new drugs that cost over $10,000, but so I'll just describe it to you. There were 41 drugs 4 years ago that cost more than $10,000, and those 41 drugs represented about 10% of total drug spending in Canada. Today, 4 years later, there are 82 drugs on the market that cost more than $10,000. And those drugs represent 25% of total drug spending. So the trajectory, the increase in spending on these high-cost drugs is really driving trend and going to continue to drive your spending higher. So I want to talk now about the different influencers on your drug plan and talk a bit about generic drugs right now. So there's three definitions I'm going to just describe of brand and generic drugs. There's two kinds of brand drugs and one kind of generic drug. So there's a single source brand name drug. That's a brand name drug that has a patent. So there is no generic. There's a single source of that product. Then there's a multiple source brand name drug. That's a brand name drug where the patent has expired and therefore generics are available, so there are multiple sources of that brand name drug. Think about Tylenol number 3. It's a prescription drug. It's a brand, but there's multiple sources of Tylenol number 3 because there's generics on the market. And then there's the generic drugs themselves. They have the same active ingredient as the brand name once the patent has expired. So when you have a plan that requires generic substitution, you're only impacting multiple source brand drugs. If there is no generic for the drug, if it's a single source, then there's no generic substitution that can happen, and so your claim is not cut back to the price of the generic. But on multiple source brand drugs, it's important to have generic substitution in the plan. Now, some people think, well, our generic drugs are maybe not as good as brand name drugs. And sometimes, we think of generic drugs like we think of generic food. And I'll use the example, if you opened up a can of Green Giant kernel corn and you looked at that corn and you then opened up the yellow label can of kernel corn, you might actually see a difference, plumper, juicier kernels. And so people sometimes think, generic drugs are inferior, but they don't realize that generic drugs are regulated very differently from foods in Canada. They're regulated by Health Canada, and they have to demonstrate what's called bioequivalence. So bioequivalence means that not only does the generic have to be the same medicine, but it has to work in your body the same way. So they do studies. So if you swallow a brand name pill, and let's say it's a 20 milligram pill, and in the first 10 minutes you've got 2 milligrams in your body, and then 20 minutes later you've got 4 milligrams in your body up until it gets your dose of the highest dose, the generic has to perform in the same way. So it has to absorb in the same time frames. They've got a little bit of a variance, but that's because they have a variance for the brand as well, because when you make a batch today and then 6 months later you make a new batch, they're never going to perform exactly the same. So plus or minus 10%, both the brand and the generic, to the absorption rates. And then that determines that the drug is bioequivalent by Health Canada. So if we stopped calling them generic drugs and started calling them bioequivalent drugs, there might be better acceptance by your plan members. But the reality is, generic drugs can have a different name, but they have to have the exact same chemical structure, identical to the brand. So if I took a brand pill in this hand and a generic pill in this hand, and I smashed the pill open and I pulled out just the medicine, they're exactly the same. It's an identical molecule. And they have to absorb into your body in exactly the same way that the brand name drug does. But sometimes you hear, well, yeah, but what about people that are allergic to the generic? They're not actually allergic to the medicine. They're allergic to these other ingredients that are in the medicine. Because pills have medicine as well as fillers and binding agents and coloring agents and flavoring agents and all these other ingredients in them that make up the pill. And that's what could be different between the brand and the generic, is the other ingredients besides the medicine. So this is actual brand name Lipitor. That's what the molecule looks like. Its chemical name is called atorvastatin calcium. These are all the other ingredients that are in the brand name Lipitor. Now we'll look at the generic version of Lipitor. Same exact molecule. It's called atorvastatin calcium. These are all the ingredients in the generic. There are some differences. But I'm going to go back to brand name Lipitor and point you to lactose, which is about the 4th line middle. The brand name has lactose. The generic does not. If you're lactose intolerant, you may prefer to take a drug that doesn't have lactose in it. So that's where some people can have a reaction or an issue to a drug. It has nothing to do with whether it's a brand or a generic. It has to do with those ingredients that are in the drug. And that's very rare that somebody would have an allergy or a problem with the non-active ingredients in a pill, because those non-active ingredients that you see here, they're also in our food, they're in our cosmetics, they're everywhere. So people who can't take a particular generic drug because of reaction usually would have to watch everything they consume because they could have a reaction, because these ingredients are everywhere. So there's really no reason not to promote generic drugs to your employees, and in fact to require them under your plan. They're legislated to be 18% of the price of the brand. So if a brand name drug costs $100, the generic by law must cost $18. Very significant cost savings for your plan. And there are different ways to administer generic substitution. So you could do no generic substitution, which highly I would not recommend. There's standard generic substitution, which says I'm going to pay for the generic unless the doctor writes no substitution on the prescription. I can tell you, I was a very successful sales rep, and I got my doctors to write no substitution all the time. Had nothing to do with the patient's allergy, had to do with me meeting my sales objectives. So that's a challenge for plans. If you do allow the doctor to write no sub, it means I'm going to make you pay 5 times more, and I'm not telling you why. And that's really not good enough in today's environment. So in today's environment, we strongly encourage, and probably 90% of plans that we have what's called an enhanced or mandatory generic substitution plan. It says I'm only paying for the generic unless your doctor tells me why I should pay for the brand. And there's a form that says, tell me your medical situation. Is it an allergy? Are you lactose intolerant? Give me a reason, and then we can support covering that higher cost drug for you. But there needs to be a reason, and not just letting the doctor write, do not substitute on the plan. And what does it save? If you let the doctor write no substitution, you're not going to actually save very much, less than 1%. But if you actually say, no, I need the medical reason, you'll save closer to 7%. And that's because, again, doctors aren't going to fill out a form if there isn't a reason. They're not, the plan member's just going to take the generic. So it's very prudent to require the use of generic drugs under your plan. So now I'll talk about the influence of pharmacies on drug plan costs. So looking at dispensing fees, pretty much everybody knows the dispensing fee varies by pharmacy. In Saskatchewan, the average dispensing fee is $11.25, but it ranges from the average is $10.70, and it ranges from a low of $4.32 at Costco to a high of $11.25. And that's common. People kind of know dispensing fees vary, but they may not know that the actual ingredient price of the medicine varies as well. Because the pharmacist will purchase the drug, then they might, if they buy it from a wholesale instead of from the drug manufacturer, the wholesaler has added a markup. So the wholesaler might have bought it for $100, but they're selling it to the pharmacy for $110. So there's a 10% wholesale markup. Then when the pharmacy sells it to you, they add their own markup, could be 5%, 10%, 15%. There are caps, but it could be as high as 15% that gets added on top of that $110, and then the dispensing fee on top of that. So there's that pharmacy markup that varies by pharmacy, and that can lead to very different total costs of a prescription at different pharmacies. Here's an example. In Costco, nobody is paying me to promote Costco. But my goodness, their prices are lower, like by far. Costco's sort of philosophy is we sell everything at cost and we make our money on our membership fees. So their prescription markup is reflective of the cost to pay the pharmacist's salary, have the technician there. There's no profit built into that markup. And as a result, their prescription costs are substantially lower than any other pharmacy. So we have a lot of employers that we work with that say, let's say my coinsurance is 80% on the plan. You can say to your employees, I'm going to change it to 90% if you go to Costco. You'll still save money. You'll save a lot of money. That's how much different the total cost of the prescription is at Costco. So that can be a great incentive, a great way to encourage your plan members to shop at places that will cost less. And again, you have to have coinsurance. If the plan's 100%, nobody's going to shop around. They don't need to. It's free. So now we'll talk about biologic and specialty drugs and their influence on drug plans. First of all, what is a biologic drug? I'll just define it in one word: expensive. They are expensive drugs, tens of thousands of dollars a year. We've got one that's $2.5 million a year now, just came out in the market this year, Strensiq. So really expensive drugs, but essentially they're extracted from living organisms, so they're DNA-based medicines. They're typically an injectable drug or require special storage and handling. So think about insulin. Insulin is a biologic drug. It is temperature controlled. It is an injectable drug. And there is no generic. Even though insulin, I mean, how old is that? There's no patent on insulin today. It was invented in the 20s, but we don't have any generics. And that's because DNA-based medicines are not considered equivalent to each other. Insulin comes from the pancreas of a pig. That pig's DNA is different from that pig's DNA. Health Canada doesn't say they're bioequivalent. They say they're biosimilar, but they're not bioequivalent, so you can't get a generic. You can't get a pharmacist to substitute and save you money. So that's one of the other challenges. Not are they very expensive to start with, but it's very difficult to be able to substitute lower cost alternatives for these biologic drugs. What are the costs of biologic drugs? The highest cost claimant on our block of business is taking a drug called Elaprase at a cost of $1.1 million a year. That is a recurring claim. So that drug, Elaprase, on average is $721,000, but some people need higher doses, and so at the highest dose, it's about $1.1 million. So you can imagine if that's an employee covered under your drug plans. You know, that person could never afford this drug without your help, without your plan, without the provincial plan maybe behind it. And so we really have to, and they can be very, very helpful, many of these drugs, really be life-changing, keep people off of disability and productive and at work. So, you know, sometimes we have clients that say, oh, we want to cut out these expensive drugs, they're costing us too much money. But you do get a lot of value in those drugs. So there's other ways to look at this and to try and manage the costs other than just cutting them out and leaving people with no coverage at all. Saskatchewan's a little bit of a different province because you do have it's a pharmacare province. So if you did, for some reason, have to cut out, cap your costs, probably this member would be able to go to the Saskatchewan government. But I can tell you in other provinces, that's not the case. This is an Ontario client and you stop paying for this, there's nowhere for that plan member to go. So this province is, you benefit greatly from the fact that there is a government program that your plan can wrap around and help you to fund the costs for some of these very high cost claimants. This is actually, I moved that slide. This is the one that shows 42 drugs over $10,000 representing 11% of spending, and a few years later it's 81 drugs that cost more than $10,000 and they're now 25% of total drug spending. So one of the challenges we have is, we add drugs typically to a drug plan based on whether it's approved by Health Canada. So when a drug gets approved by Health Canada, we add it to your plan. The problem is that Health Canada approves drugs based on two things. Is it safe? Does it work better than nothing? Placebo. So we get a lot of new drugs that are entering the market that actually work no better than the older drug that was already on the market. But the new drug comes at a much higher cost. And so we do have a government body in Canada that does compare new drugs to old drugs. It's not Health Canada, it's the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, and that's around how we set the price of those drugs. And so they put drugs into one of four categories. It's a breakthrough drug. Never seen anything like this before. It's a miracle kind of a treatment. Not many drugs hit that category. Then there's drugs that offer a substantial improvement over existing drugs. So maybe the older drug was an injection and the new drug is a pill. Big improvement for the person, not having to take a needle every day. So that could be an example of a substantial improvement drug. Maybe it's a moderate improvement drug. About 25% of drugs are moderately better than the other ones, meaning maybe there's a few fewer side effects. But 61% of the drugs that we're spending the most money on have absolutely no value or very little value over the existing drugs that they're replacing. I like to use the example, it's a new birth control pill. It doesn't get you less pregnant, but it comes at a much higher cost. Does it make sense to automatically add all of these new drugs to the plan just based on Health Canada's approval? Probably not anymore in this environment. And that's really what's happening in this year and last year. As insurance companies, we are changing the way we administer your drug plans. We're no longer offering open formularies that automatically cover everything because we're paying for things that we're not getting a good value out of. So why does the doctor prescribe this stuff then? That's a big question, and this is a video, and I'm not going to show the video today, but it's a guy by the name of Dr. Mike Evans. You might have heard of him before. He's famous for these videos where they're kind of cartoon-based videos. He has one called 23.5 Hours, and it starts off, "Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Evans," and there's a little cartoon drawing of a doctor, and then he goes into explaining what he's going to explain. So he does these really great videos that explain complicated things in simple ways. And he has a video around why does your doctor prescribe what they're prescribing? So it's based on 4 things. And you would think one of those 4 things would be you, right? The doctor is looking at you, talking to you, examining you, maybe putting, a stethoscope up to you. You would think you might be part of the factor in what they choose to prescribe, but you're actually not. And as this video explained, it's because the science of choice means it's really impossible for the doctor to consider you specifically unless they want to take an hour to prescribe every drug. Because the truth is there's 20,000 drugs on the market. There's typically dozens, if not hundreds of choices the doctor can make. If you've got high blood pressure, there's probably 500 different drugs that can be prescribed for that condition. They're not going to really do it based on you and analyze which for you of the 500. They kind of, what they do is they pick, for blood pressure, these are the 2 I like, and for cholesterol, these are the ones I like, and they just pick and choose the drugs. And how do they pick and choose those has to do with these 4 things. So research that they've read, which should be great, right? The problem is that only good research is published, not the bad research. So if you do a clinical trial and you're a drug manufacturer and the drug fails in the trial, you just don't publish that one. But then you do another trial and then you find a good result and you publish that. So the challenge is, there's actually a movement in the medical community to say we should have legally require you to publish all your trials, whether they're good or bad, so the doctors get both sides. So the research the doctors are getting is only the good research that the companies want them to read. Then what's advertised, I can tell you as a sales rep, I was in that doctor's office and we were promoting and we were, in fact, sending doctors to events like this in a room where there'd be a speaker, a top cardiologist, and all the doctors in the city would be going to this continuing education event. It's really around promotion and advertising and, probably eating lobster at a fine restaurant while they're getting this education from this doctor, this experienced, guy. And so that really is about advertising and promotion, and it's what's freshest in their mind. But it's most money spent on advertising drugs, or in 95% of all the money spent on advertising drugs are for drugs that offer little or no therapeutic benefit. So those are the drugs your doctors are being promoted. Now, they are also using their own experience, driven by samples. If I walked in the door with a big bag of samples, I was guaranteed to see the doctor. The doctor then would take those samples, give them to the patients. Oh, do you want to, gee, I see you've got high cholesterol. Let's maybe try this sample. You go home, you try it, you come back a month later. Doctor says, how you feeling? Feeling pretty good. Okay, I'm comfortable. I've got some experience with that drug. And so those samples really drive their experience, which means that might be one of the 2 drugs for cholesterol that they choose, etc. And then they go based on what others prescribe. I have some family members and friends who are physicians, and I talk to them about this, and I say, why do you prescribe all that crap? 61% of drugs that don't have any value. Why are you prescribing that? And you know what? If they're honest with me, they say, well, I kind of have to. Because if I'm seen to be prescribing outside the norm, I could be called into question. I certainly could be frowned upon by my peers. So what others prescribe, what the norm is driving and influencing a lot of what your doctor's prescribing. So at the end of the day, it doesn't have a heck of a lot to do with you. So now let's move over and talk about consumerism, the influence of consumerism on your drug plan spending. So what is consumerism? Consumerism means that I, as a consumer, will seek the best value. For example, if I want to buy a car, I'm going to shop around the market. I'm going to figure out what are all the cars that are out there. I'm going to determine how much I can afford. I'm going to determine what car I like the best. I'm going to pay for it, and I'm going to drive it. And so out of all of that, because it's all about me, I'm going to get the best value. I'm going to negotiate the price. I'm going to get the best car, and I'm going to take care of that car. And I care about it all because it's mine, and I've made all of those decisions. As that's what consumerism is. We have no consumerism in drug plans. Why? Well, I might take the drug, but I don't choose it. My doctor does. And I don't pay for it. My plan does. Or at least I don't pay for all of it. I pay, maybe if I have coinsurance, I pay 10 or 20% of it. So we really don't have a lot of consumerism that happens within a drug plan. And the challenge is, as we know, the doctors can prescribe drug A or drug B, really is going to have the same outcome for you, but they typically start from the most expensive, the one that's freshest in their mind. And if you come back and say, oh, I had some side effects or it didn't work, then they'll work their way down. We got to change the trajectory. We really have to design our plans so that doctors have to prescribe from the bottom up and work their way up if drugs are not effective. And generic substitution plays a big role in this. So you might have an old brand drug that was $100. The new drug comes out at $150. And you would think, well, if they prescribe the new drug, it's going to cost us $50. It's not, because the old drug had a generic that was $18. So we went from $18 to $150. That's the drug mix effect in demonstration. That's how expensive it is for your plans. It's incredibly expensive. And
the 18% thing, that's legislative. Like, it can't go up or down from that. It's just legislative.
it's not for every single drug, but for the most part, if it's a pill that you swallow, it's legislated across Canada to be 18% of the price of the brand. Some caveats, if there's first generic out, might have a little higher advantage for a short period of time before other generics come out, if they've fought patents and gone to court with that expense. But generally speaking, it's a legislated price of 18% of the price of the brand. Now, anybody know what question the doctor always asks just before they write you a prescription? Do you have a drug plan? It was our industry, when I was in pharma, that taught the doctor to ask that question. Because really what the doctor is saying is, do you care how much this costs? And what do we say? I got a drug plan. We've just told the doctor, I don't care. So they've prescribed the most expensive drug. If we could just change the answer to that question, if you could teach your employees to say, I have a drug plan, but it encourages generics. Do you have a generic for my disease? Can you prescribe a generic? Or I have a drug plan, but I have to pay 20% of the cost. Is this going to be expensive? The minute those words come out of the patient's mouth, the doctor will care about the cost. They think they don't care. They think it doesn't matter, and they certainly don't understand insurance and benefits and premiums. So if we could do nothing more than change how your employees answer that question, we could drive a lot of change in drug spending. And so this is why coinsurance is important. Deductibles are important, that sort of thing, so that we can change the answer to that question in the doctor's office. In fact, there is some movement to say doctors should actually know a lot more about the price of the prescription drugs. And you know, doctors could, if they took the time. There are websites and sources where they can go and look up the price of drugs, but again, we never really encourage them to do that. But this physician is saying we should give even more access to doctors to really understand the price. Now, I kind of, you know, I don't know the price of cars, but I know a Honda's less expensive than a Ferrari. And your doctor knows when they're prescribing Ferraris over Hondas. They do. So it's good to have them know the price, but even better for the plan member to say, hey, I care about the cost and I got to pay part of it, and let's work together to find something that's going to be cost effective for me. And there was an interesting announcement in Ontario in September, and I hope this spreads nationally. Ontario is planning to force the pharmaceutical industries to divulge their payments to doctors. And this is something that's been done in the United States. In California, they passed legislation called the Sunshine Act that required doctors to register all of their income, like including free lunches, everything that they get from the pharmaceutical companies, into a database so that you can type in the name of your doctor and see how influenced they are by the pharmaceutical companies. So I think that will be a great thing. Now, I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that doctors get paid to write prescriptions. They don't directly, but they more get influenced. You know, I'll give you an example. And this is, you know, what we used to do when I was in the industry. We'd study personality types of the doctor, and different personalities will be driven by different motivations. So, you know, I might walk into the doctor's office and say, Doc, we can cure cancer together. I just need 40 prescriptions a week. And if you write 40 prescriptions a week, we'll have enough sales to generate the research to cure cancer. Do you want to play a part in that? And then, by the way, I buy the data to find out if they did write 40 prescriptions a week and come back, then, you didn't give me 40 prescriptions this week, Doc. How are we going to cure cancer together? So that can be one of the ways. Or maybe they're a doctor that likes the prestige of being an expert and standing up at a conference like this and educating other doctors. So if you're a high prescriber, you'd have a lot of experience, and you could get speaking engagements, speaker fees, and those fees can be tens of thousands of dollars. Could be traveling around the world educating other doctors, but you got to be high prescribers. Or maybe it's we want you to sit on our advisory board. We need doctors on our advisory board. So those are the kinds of monies that doctors are earning from drug companies, and it's big money. It can be a lot of money every year for specific doctors, and that's why the government is saying we actually have to have doctors start to register this information and have plan members maybe make a choice on a doctor partially based on that influence that they have. So what does this all mean? Employer-sponsored prescription drug plans really have traditionally covered prescription by law drugs. You know, when Health Canada approves a drug, it gets added to your plan. Covering all drugs is no longer affordable, sustainable, or even practical. Formularies really will become the norm for most plans in Canada. Most carriers will require it. You know, most of you in this room, while you may not be aware of it, probably have a prescription by law plan. You're not limiting coverage just to the drugs on the Saskatchewan formulary. You're at allowing coverage for all drugs approved by Health Canada. And most of the carriers, all of the carriers, are pretty much saying we can't afford that anymore and are moving our clients into managed formularies of some type. And I would say, don't resist that. You know, and you know, some of you might think, well, what if my employees need this drug? When you have a managed formulary, what you're focusing on is those 61% of drugs that don't offer any value. Those are the drugs that are typically not going to be added. That new birth control pill doesn't get you less pregnant, not going to add it. So you're really generally not taking things away from employees that, you know, a drug that somebody really needs. Those breakthrough drugs, those substantial improvement drugs are listed on most formularies. Formularies help to get rid of the waste, the unnecessary drugs. So I would encourage you not to resist that. I encourage you to work with your employees and communicate that. I, as a carrier, this talk that I'm giving you today, I give these at employee meetings and webinars and that sort of thing. Whoever your carrier is can help support the education to your members around how to manage this drug spending going forward. And so just to summarize, the market situation has changed and the risk of catastrophic growth on drug plans is really greater than ever. We know that the forces that increase your spending are not going to be able to be offset by the forces that decrease your spending. And your drug plan design will determine how your employees are going to spend their money, right? If it's 100%, they won't care about the cost. If you build some consumerism into those plans, that is how we're going to be able to keep drug plans affordable and sustainable. So it's important that you work with your advisor. Look at your drug plan design. I like to have just a drug plan meeting once a year with my clients. Once a year, we're just going to have 2 hours. We're going to pull the data. We're going to look at your design. We're going to see what we can do to make sure that we're keeping this drug plan affordable and sustainable. And absolutely building that consumerism into plans and teaching members how to shop smart is the way that we're going to keep our drug plans affordable and sustainable. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Don't be shy.
Can you recap that 90-day fill thing? Is that a requirement or is that just an option?
That is an option, and the reason is that if you force everybody onto 90 days, the problem is you'd probably throw some drugs into the garbage. About a third of the time when you're on a maintenance drug, you are first starting on that drug. You don't know if it's going to give you side effects or anything, so you don't want to throw a big supply to find out you've got side effects. Then about another third of maintenance drugs are switched. That's the new drug mix. Oh, you used to be on Lipitor, but now I'm switching you over to Crestor. So you know, again, if you've got big supplies, then drugs can go in the garbage. So just encouraging your members where it makes sense for them to take 90-day supplies is a good thing.
Is that Saskatchewan or across Canada? Or?
Well, actually, that's a good point. Saskatchewan's a little bit of a unique province. In Saskatchewan, actually, oh, sorry. Well, yeah, you know, Saskatchewan is a little bit unique, and so it is hard to get it's not hard to get a 90-day prescription. You can get a 90-day prescription here, but the pharmacist will charge 3 dispensing fees, not 1. In every other province in Canada, the pharmacist would not be allowed to charge 3 dispensing fees for dispensing once. But all of the carriers do allow pharmacists in Saskatchewan to charge 3 dispensing fees. So this 90-day supply thing would probably be more applicable to other provinces if you've got national clients. But why is that? Why would we let pharmacists charge 3 dispensing fees here and not anywhere else? It's because pharmacists make less money in this province than any other province in Canada because the government caps the markup. Remember when I said the markup could be 5, 10, 15%? In Saskatchewan, it's capped at $50. Could be whatever percentage, but you cannot earn more than $50 as a markup. In every other province, it's not capped. So in Saskatchewan, pharmacies would literally close down if they couldn't get 90-day supplies for 3 dispensing fees. So even though it sounds like, gee, we're paying them too much, you're really not. Pharmacists in Saskatchewan have that cap in place that is a legislated cap by the province, and they can't charge more than that, and as a result, it is actually fair to pay them 3 dispensing fees for a 90-day supply. So this is a very unique, and I should have clarified that, so I'm glad that you...
So even on a $10,000 drug, they can only mark it up $50?
That's correct. And in any other province, they'd get at least 10%. Right?
They go to like Biologic, just like somewhere that's specialized.
Well, yeah, there are. In fact, a lot of the carriers now on those biologic drugs will force you to go to certain pharmacies because we've negotiated a lower markup. So that's how we get around that, we don't necessarily negotiate a dollar cap, but we take force a lower percentage in return for the volume that we're sending to those pharmacies. So that's fairly common. All of the large carriers in Canada would have these specialty pharmacy networks that patients have to use for those certain drugs, only those really high-cost drugs where the prices have been negotiated. So the question was, do some drug plans not authorize a 90-day prescriptions and you have to take only 30 days? Actually, that's a great question. That's correct, because there are kind of two categories of drugs. They call them acute and maintenance. Acute prescriptions would not be allowed to have a 90-day supply. Those would be things like antibiotics that you're not going to take for 3 months, you're going to take for 3 weeks. So typically the computer system would say if it's considered an acute drug, we don't allow a 90-day supply because we know for sure there's a likelihood of waste there. So it's only on the basket of drugs that are considered maintenance, like blood pressure, cholesterol, that are considered maintenance drugs. So it looks like your plan design says I don't ever pay for a 90-day supply on anything, even a maintenance drug? Or it's just that you have to do that on paper. You still get reimbursed, but you do that other 60 days on paper claim. Is that correct? So it's still covering 90 days, but in a unique way. That's just a plan design decision, and there probably is a very good historical reason why it was done that way. Sometimes we do something, at one point, and years later we're still doing it that way. So probably there's some history there that would make the reason for that make sense. In today's world, I don't know if it does. You'd have to take a look at the design and see what the reasoning was.
And we will do that. We will work on the team, so you're making me curious.
Yeah, I'm curious too.
So we'll take a look at that.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
So we talk about rising costs, and we talk about managing, and I know Mike's going to speak, or others speak here a little bit about, some things that relates to the comparative on a drug plan. So opiates.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you seeing that, and more importantly, where are you seeing the initiative, if any, from the doctors to manage that? Because that's a runaway bust.
It is. So the question was about opiates and where are we seeing that going. We actually, and I didn't put the data here, but we did have a trend report where we looked at the top 10 categories of spending in 2010, compared that to 2016. And number 10, at 2.9% of total drug spending, was narcotics in both time periods, in 2010 and again in 2016. So no decrease over those 6 years, no decrease at all. In fact, an increase because we saw generics come in, but the prices didn't go down, which means we had more prescriptions coming in. So we're really not seeing on our drug plans a decrease in narcotic spending, if anything, an increase. And there are different programs. We have narcotics programs where we're actually monitoring patients and their use. There are things you can do that way. Perhaps medical marijuana at some point might offer some relief and help to get people off of narcotics and maybe onto other drugs. There isn't enough evidence of that yet, so we're not going to rush to that, but I think there's hope for the future.
And that's a good question. So if you could speculate on putting you, I don't think my mic works. Does it, Bill? Can I talk to my mic without clashing?
Okay. I, just because I have to be a crap disturber, so is that a nice way of saying it? I'm going to be more crap after I talk with Barb. I'll let you know. But anyways, when do you see it? Because it's going to get a DIN number, I speculate. When do you see it getting a DIN number, medical marijuana, as it will, to your point, hopefully manage, I believe, our bigger crisis that we're dealing with right now, right in front of our very eyes?
I think it will probably get a DIN number. If you'd asked me 6 months ago, I'd say 10 years. I'm changing that. I think there's.
I remember.
There's enough of a lobby. There's enough force. There's enough money to be made that there's pressure to add a DIN sooner. So we might see a DIN in 2 to 3 years. But again, I don't think that means we should automatically cover it under benefit plans.
No,
You know,
it's going to have to go through.
well,
no
we
different
still
than
need the
trial prescription.
evidence.
Yeah.
We still need to know that it really is effective for various conditions. We need, one of the good things that a DIN will give us is a dose. Right now, like, what is the dose of a joint, you know?
Mike's going to have some fun with this one.
So and the dose will help us to determine, well, 10 milligrams will help, you know. So we need a DIN, we need the research. So just because there's a DIN doesn't mean it's going to be covered. We still need more evidence, and I think that's going to take more time, is the research and the evidence to show where is it appropriate to cover. I think we've already got evidence on epilepsy and some other conditions, but we need more evidence of truly how effective it is.
Any more questions?
I think in the past you made the presentation available, is that?
Yes. For just so you know, for the presentations today, they'll be on video. So yes, that's to our man Phil back there. So, no other questions? Going once, going twice, done.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Barb. Thank you very much.